I was on the left coming out of Chicago and going to graduate school. I moved right somewhat under the influence of the intellectual evolution of becoming an economist, and somewhat in reaction to things that were going on in American political economy and culture. I was a liberal before I was a conservative, before I was a liberal, before I was a conservative, kind of thing like that. I mean, when I came out of Chicago to MIT to graduate school, I was as predictably progressive liberal as you would expect any African-American working class person to be. But I did move to the right. And during the 1980s, I was a Reagan Republican. What
accounts for that change?
I point to a couple of things. One of them was that I drank the Kool-Aid on neoliberalism. And I guess I'm still drinking it to a certain degree. I mean, I became an economist. And although I was at MIT, which would have thought of itself as distinctly to the left of the Chicago school, I have tremendous respect for the Chicago school and for the insights of the Milton Friedmans and the Gary Beckers of the world and the George Stiglers of the world and people of this kind about markets, about the Friedrich von Hayeks of the world is perhaps how I should put this. I can remember reading Road to Serfdom. I can remember reading Law, Legislation, and Liberty as a early in my career and being very impressed by the power of this way of thinking. So there was my market-oriented kind of distrust of central planning and big government and a kind of belief in the power, the sort of liberating power of people pursuing their own interests, Adam Smith style and whatnot, on the one hand. On the other hand, I was traumatized by my experience in the late 70s and early 80s I was at the University of Michigan for a few years. The city of Detroit, really just collapsed before my eyes, and thinking that a lot of what was wrong had to do with some of the cultural criticisms of the government programs and also of general changes in American culture, the collapse of the family and all this kind of stuff that was very much a part of the social criticism world back in the 1980s and early 1990s. I mean, I thought Dan Quayle was right about the Murphy Brown thing. No one's going to remember what I'm talking about.
Right.
This is Dan Quayle giving a speech criticizing a television show for portraying a woman unmarried having a child. And there then ensued a whole big debate in American pop culture about whether or not a woman having a child without a husband was a good or a bad thing.
That's an interesting moment in history because he was vice president then. And that what his point about Murphy Brown, I think, was to some extent embedded in a larger theme that he developed, possibly with Bill Kristol, who was at that point his, I don't want to say guru, but was certainly providing input into his brain. Which
he was his chief of staff.
Yeah, he was his chief of staff. Okay. And by some accounts, providing input into Dan Quayle's brain was a job somebody had to do, but I won't pursue that any further.
This is the guy who could not spell potato, if I recall the.
That's my recollection. But one of the themes they developed was something that's become a huge part of American political discourse, a critique of the, quote, cultural elites. I think they use that phrase and fostering, I think, a kind of resentment on the right of these kind of coastal cultural elites who had, indifference, if not indifference to, if not contempt for the needs and values of everyday middle Americans and so on. That was a theme that they started to develop back then. And Murphy Brown was an example of a liberal elite, that show.
Yeah.
Embodying these values that were being imposed on America by people who didn't understand the real problems that real people have, that in real, that at lower income levels than Murphy Brown, the TV character Murphy Brown was living at. Having a child without somebody to help you raise it was not necessarily a good idea. That was the Dan Quayle critique. But I think of that as, in a way, the beginning of a conversation that's still being had. But that's a little bit of a digression. So
yeah, I was just saying I was on the left coming out of Chicago and going to graduate school. I moved right somewhat under the influence of the intellectual evolution of becoming an economist and somewhat in reaction to things that were going on in American political economy and culture. But I had I had a epiphany, or a series of epiphanies, really. I went through a very traumatic period in my life where of scandal and public humiliation. I went through a religious conversion, became a practicing Christian. And in this period of transition, I reevaluated my political outlook, and I began to move left. And when that 1994 conference, I remember it very well. I don't remember you at the conference, Bob.
No, you wouldn't. I don't think anybody in that room would. But
Marianne Herrnstein had put out this book, and it was going to go on and sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and it was a real event in American political culture. And it, amongst other things, lent support to the outlook about inequality and race, in which genetic differences between racial groups would be a factor in accounting for the disparity. I think that's a generous way of putting it. And I was extremely dubious about that intellectual move. It was not the only book being published in those years that gave me pause. Dinesh D'Souza was also at the American Enterprise Institute, and he put out a scurrilous book called The End of Racism, which I had contempt for. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom were writing in those years about race, and their book came out a couple of years after Marianne Herrnstein. American Black and Wright, I wrote a very critical review of Abby and Steve's book. I say Abby and Steve because they were my friends. And my review that was published by Jack Beatty in The Atlantic, 7,500 words, took them apart chapter and verse, and they never forgave me for it. But I went through this period of deep reaction against my own conservatism, and I moved to the left, very self-consciously so. And this went on for years. I mean, it culminated in the first decade of this century when I turned my attention to the issue of mass incarceration. I gave these lectures out at Stanford. I published a small book, MIT Press, on race, incarceration, and American values. And I don't think anyone can read it without seeing it as a left-of-center critique of the criminal justice system. It influenced Michelle Alexander. She thanks me, the author of The New Jim Crow, in her introduction for helping to move her in that direction. So I was left, and I was right, then I was left. But the post-Ferguson climate on racial issues is causing me to reevaluate some of my sort of disquiet with the way that affirmative action has evolved, and my dislike for the tenor of some of the popular rhetoric coming out, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and whatnot, about the race issue. I find myself back kind of right of center on those issues again.
So it sounds like the as far as your initial drift to the right, it had to do partly with a purely intellectual attraction to, let's face it, the beauty of certain aspects of just kind of classical economics, kind of Adam Smith's books. I mean, whatever you think about the market and how things wind up being distributed, it is an extremely powerful mechanism and embodies certain kinds of efficiencies. And once you understand those efficiencies, that has a very powerful appeal, especially if you compared them, as Hayek did, to an alternative system where the decision making is centralized and all the inefficiencies that arise from that, which of course were manifest in, for example, the Soviet economy and so on. So it sounds like there's the intellectual appeal to that. It sounds like there is also, with reference to the Murphy Brown thing, you're having grown up, let's just say, in the real world more than perhaps some liberal intellectuals had, and having a kind of a reality check that you could impose on some ideas of the left that you might think were, a little too detached from reality. Is that a fair summary of two sources of the initial appeal of the right?
It is a fair summary. I mean, in the real world. I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
That's very real. That's very real, as I understand.
Working class. There was a lot of stuff going on that, I don't know that anybody could really credit it as kind of constructive or helpful to the well-being of the micro society in which I was a part. And a cultural criticism of that seemed entirely warranted. I also grew up not especially religious, but in a milieu that honored religious faith, that took it seriously. Mm-hmm. I was not, indoctrinated with any particular, religious theological thing, but still, people took religion really quite seriously, and reference to God was really quite commonplace. It was a relatively culturally conservative milieu. Gay rights was not the most popular kind of, innovation of thinking in the community that I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, things have changed since then. But, I watched what was going on in Detroit, and I was simply appalled by, the crime and the disorder, and also by what I thought to be the inadequacy of the knee-jerk liberal response to it, which was that it was all about racism, and if we could just up the budget on a social program, things are going to be better. I was a long way from being convinced that was true.